Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Kelsey Carrier. I want to first off thank DynamicsCon for the opportunity to present today and for hosting this event in such an organized fashion virtually. Thank you all for listening in, and I'm excited to share some best practices for D365 customer engagement security design. First off, a little bit of background on me. I started working in consulting after graduating from University of Georgia with my degree in management information systems. I joined Protiviti, who is one of the sponsors of this event and a proud Microsoft partner. At Protiviti, I specialize in our enterprise application services practice, and my work is primarily focused within Microsoft Dynamics solutions. So who is Protiviti? For those of you that don't know, we're a rapidly growing global consulting firm, and we did $1.2 billion in revenue in 2019, and we have over 6,000 professionals in almost 30 countries. Our consulting services span finance, technology, operations, data analytics, governance, risk, and internal audit. And who are our clients? We've served over 60% of Fortune 1000 companies and 25% of Fortune Global 500 companies. However, we also work with smaller companies and often rapidly growing companies with upcoming IPOs. As I touched on earlier, we have deep expertise in Dynamics consulting, which is why I'm here to speak to you all today. Protiviti provides a full suite of Dynamics consulting services, including implementations, security design, and data management across the suite of Dynamics products. I personally have focused most of my work within security design for both customer engagement and for D365 finance. And now I'll give you a brief overview of our agenda and what our next few minutes together is going to look like. First, I want to talk security as a big picture item and help business leaders understand what the problem is and why it's a worthwhile topic. Then we'll dive into the security architecture of customer engagement, covering the two main concepts that tie together to ultimately give a user access. We'll then touch on the organization hierarchy within the system and understand how this structure lays the foundation for your system's security landscape. Once we understand the concepts, we'll move into role design methodology, your options when it comes to building custom roles, and security role build best practices. We'll follow that by a couple of the powerful possibilities that teams within CE can provide and include some tricks for role provisioning. Finally, we'll wrap it up with high-level key principles of access governance and what your organization needs to consider for continuity. First, I want to take a minute to ask you if any of these items sound familiar to how your organization handles security within CE or within any of your systems. We're using the out-of-the-box roles to assign security access to our users. We regularly use a system administrator role as a regular solution to resolve access issues. When new users need access, we just copy their access from other users. Our users often have difficulty locating the data within the system that they need. Our users don't know they have the access to other data, so it isn't really risky, right? If any of these sound familiar to you, you're not alone. However, these are common signs that security has probably taken a back seat in your organization, and it may be time to consider next steps. So let's understand a little bit more about what the problem actually is. Within customer engagement, Microsoft provides a few out-of-the-box security roles available to assign to users. These roles are based on common job titles such as salesperson, account manager, or CEO. So what's the problem with using these roles? These roles are typically meant to be a suggestion of how access can be given to different users. However, no single organization is the same, and most likely, your company's sales representative is not responsible for the same exact set of activities as sales reps for every other customer using Dynamics. These out-of-the-box roles often can provide excessive access, which can lead to a variety of different problems. Excessive access can lead to high-risk segregation of duties conflicts, in which consequences can be particularly financially impactful. It can also lead to inappropriate sensitive access rights, where users may have the ability to see too much private or valuable customer data. Access to too much data can lead to the risk of data error and lost data in your system. When a user has access to more data than they need, data integrity is at risk, even from non-malicious manipulation of data, as records can be accidentally tampered with or even deleted. Finally, out-of-the-box roles often present users with a cluttered user interface. The navigation panel of any system can be intimidating when you have every option possible, including that of customer engagement. When users see a large number of tiles and options on their screen, there's a greater chance of them getting lost or poking around in the system, and the more difficult it is to do their job. So what is our philosophy? We believe it's best practice to create custom security roles that are tailored to your organization. We believe security design should be based on end user requirements first and foremost, and led by the principle of least privilege access in the organization's defined risk framework. When we refer to least privilege access, we mean that a user has access to see and modify only the things necessary to do their job. With this approach, we minimize risk, we maintain the accuracy of system data, and we provide end users with a clean interface to help streamline their tasks. Now that you understand where we're going with this, let's get into the security architecture of D365 CE. So let's start with the basics. How does a user get access in customer engagement? There are two main concepts that are intertwined to provide a user access. You can't understand the security of CE with just one of these concepts. A common mistake is to just understand one of these without the other, but it's the nature by which they tie together that provides a user access to what they can see and do within the system. As mentioned, Dynamics uses a role-based security model. So the first of these concepts is that a user must have a proper security role or roles. We'll dive into what security roles actually look like in more detail in just a minute. Secondly, a user must have access to the proper records. Records are the system's data elements. And the CE concept of record ownership might be new to users that are used to other systems. We'll touch more on the concept of record ownership in just a few minutes, but first, let's go into more detail on what a security role looks like. So what are the key features of a CE security role? Most commonly, a role is assigned to an individual user to define a user's view of data and the user's interaction with that data. Security roles can also be assigned to teams, which we'll get more into later. A user needs to be assigned at least one security role in order to even get into the environment. If a user doesn't have a security role assignment, they'll be blocked from the environment upon login. But each user can have multiple security roles, and there's actually no limit to the number of roles a given user can be given. It's important to know that a security role belongs to a business unit. Most commonly, security roles are created on the organization's root business unit so that it can be assigned to any user. However, you can create a security role specific to particular business units. We need to remember that security roles have a cumulative effect. When a user has multiple security roles, the user has the privileges associated with all of the security roles. And there are three main components that drive a role's definition: entities, privileges, and access levels. So let's talk about what each of those means. The screenshot here depicts the security role configuration screen. It may seem a little overwhelming at first, but there's a clear method to the layout with three main areas to pay attention to. First of all, pay attention to the column on the left side where we have our list of entity names. An entity is a data element that generally refers to a type of record. You'll recognize some of these, such as account and contact, as these are some of the primary user-facing entities. but there will be some here that you may not recognize because they hold technical data in non-user facing type records. Any custom entities that your organization has created will also appear here within the Custom Entities tab. Now, let's pay attention to the top portion of the screenshot. Across the top, you'll see the list of 8 privileges that determine the level of access a user has to a specific record or record type. Most of these names are intuitive. However, the latter half have less obvious meanings. Append means to associate the current record with another record, while append to is required to associate another record with the current record. The assign privilege gives a user the ability to give ownership of a record to another user, and the share privilege gives a user the ability to share records with another user. Thirdly, down here on the bottom, we have access levels. The access levels are represented by the 4 different colored circles. These determine how high or deep in the organization hierarchy the user can perform each individual privilege. The full green circle denotes that a user has access to all records within the organization. The deep access level gives access to records in the user's business unit and all child business units. Business unit access level, the half circle, provides access to only records within the user's business unit. And then finally, basic access level limits a user's access to records owned by the user or by the team that the user is a member of. Let's move on to the second concept, record-based security. This will allow you to understand how users can collaborate and how data can be shared and restricted. Understanding this concept will also help you make more sense of the access levels that we just talked about. So when an entity is created in CE, it's configured to have one of 2 main ownership types, organization-owned or user or team-owned. It's important to note that you can't change the ownership type of an entity once it's created. You would actually have to go back and recreate the entity. Typically, entities chosen to be organization-owned contain data involving something that belongs to or that can be viewed by the entire organization. In other words, it's something that's pertinent to all parts of the business and doesn't need to be restricted. When an entity is owned by the organization, any given user either has full or none access on these types of records. Security roles can then be configured at these 2 access levels, none and global, for that particular entity. And then there's no way to further segment that data within an organization-owned entity. Thus, this type is primarily set aside for a select few entities that have no harm in being visible to everyone, such as templates or countries within the system. On the other hand, there are user or team-owned system entities. Because these records are owned by a user or a team, they're connected to a business unit. That is the business unit of the user or the team owner of that record. Therefore, these entities allow for further segmentation of data and participate heavily in role-based security. This is where it gets interesting. Then the security roles can be configured at any of the 5 access levels that we saw in the past slide for that particular entity. None, basic or user, local or business unit, deep or global. Now that we understand role security and record ownership, let's take a look at the organization hierarchy. When implementing CRM, a company must carefully consider how to set up their hierarchy. You want your hierarchy to be scalable. You want to allow for proper data segmentation, yet you also want to provide enough flexibility for collaboration. As we saw when discussing security roles, the hierarchy can create proper dividing lines or boundaries between data when set up correctly. Once a hierarchy is set up, however, it's very difficult to change and it can require some undesired rework. So it's very important to make your decision carefully during implementation. The business unit is the largest component of the security foundation in CE. A common misconception is that a business unit needs to be set up to match your company's structure, matching one-to-one with your actual business units in your company. However, this does not always need to be the case, and often it's not the best structure possible. Think of a business unit rather as a logical area where you can divide out roles and divide out potential areas you don't want people to share data. If multiple levels are desired, a subordinate business unit can be set up in a parent-child relationship. Your main thing to consider is the levels at which you want to split out your data. So some key things to remember: a user can only belong to one business unit, and a team can only belong to one business unit. However, individual users can be assigned to multiple teams. Then a team can include users from different business units. In the diagram, you can see that Team 2 contains users from all three of these different business units. So it's really important to set up boundaries with the right amount of flexibility, because this ultimately can determine whether a user has access to just the right data, but not too much to do their job. So let's bring it all together with an example here. We're going to look at the lead entity, which is a user or team-owned record. In this simple example, USA Incorporation is an organization that's divided into only two different business units. We have the West region and the East region. Carrie is a user in the West region business unit. So what lead records can she see? At basic level, she can access only the lead records that she herself owns. At the local level or business unit level, she can access the lead records that she owns and the lead records that Mike owns, since he is in that business unit. At deep level access, for this particular instance, the access is equivalent to the local level, since her business unit has no parent business units and it's more of a flat structure. Finally, at global access level, Carrie can see her own records, those that Mike owns, those that the Georgia sales team owns, and those that Susan owns. So as you see, with organization level access, we can cross over between business units and see truly all organization-owned records. So let's get into our custom role build approach. As discussed earlier, out-of-the-box roles like sales representative or marketing officer can lead to excessive access. This visual here shows how a user may only need access to one or two of the functionalities in each of several out-of-the-box roles. So some organizations might take the easy way out and just patch it up quickly by just giving a combination of a few of the out-of-the-box roles and not really stopping to analyze what implications this could have. So in order to create custom roles, you have two main options. You can either duplicate and adjust existing security roles or build your roles from scratch. For our duplicate and adjust approach, we're referring to copying a Microsoft out-of-the-box role and changing the privileges and access levels to meet the customized build that you want. For this approach, let's weigh the benefits and costs. You'll likely have a shorter and more cost-effective build time since you are leveraging existing roles. However, there are definitely some drawbacks. Adjusting out-of-box roles can still require a lot of expertise. The role configuration panel can be difficult to comprehend if you're not familiar with it. And without being able to speak to the original builder of the role, it's hard to comprehend the methodology behind each and every privilege and access level. You also need to have knowledge of end-to-end processes and the ways that these entities tie together before you just start adding and removing things based on assumptions that it's that straightforward. In our experience, this approach works best when you're truly making more one-off type changes, such as adjusting an access level or removing a specific privilege from a role. For example, if your organization decides that the out-of-box salesperson role fits the requirements of your organization, with the only exception being that you don't want to grant delete rights on account records, you can easily remove that privilege from your copied security role. If you do choose this approach, it's always better to copy the role, rename it, and build from there, as opposed to making modifications directly to the out-of-the-box role. That way, you still have the original role for reference and backup purposes. As for the second approach, you have the option to build from scratch. This approach will obviously be more labor intensive and require more expertise, which would bear a higher cost. As for the second approach, you have the option to build from scratch. This approach will obviously be more labor intensive and require more expertise, which would bear a higher cost. However, it provides your build team the freedom to completely determine the role architecture rather than live by the Microsoft-defined structure. Because a user can have as many security roles as you want in CE, you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to your data security methods. With this approach, your build team can take a methodical approach and have an intentional purpose behind each and every privilege and access level given. You also have the freedom to start clean with transparency and role naming conventions to allow for easier user administration and simpler user access reviews. You definitely have the ability to leverage a combination of both approaches. In a perfect case, your organization could use the copy and adjust approach for roles with very minimal tweaks and use option 2 for areas with more sensitive access and areas that you want to hone in on more. So what are the best practices that we teach for designing your role architecture? In order to create the most efficient and scalable model possible, leading practice is to use what we call task-based roles to drive the development of job-based roles. So let's get into what we mean when we say task-based roles and job-based roles. We start with task roles first. Tasks are based on low-level activities or tasks that a user needs to perform in the system. The tasks are driven by the key risks that are identified during the development of the risk framework, and they usually call out key activities for sensitive areas or areas in which we particularly want to hone in on for our data segmentation. In D365 CE, some of these areas that we commonly want to focus on include contacts, leads, opportunities, invoices, and orders. Most organizations will want to know who in their company has the ability to maintain leads and maintain contacts, and within what level. They'll also find it important to know exactly who has the ability to create invoices or delete orders. And most likely, you'll have some important customizations within your system you'll want to watch out for as well. So the idea behind coming up with these tasks is not to come up with a role for each and every single activity, yet to hone in on those primary functions and sensitive access areas that could have downstream effects. So there's two main questions you must ask yourself and those in your organization as a basis to designing each of these task-based security roles. Two questions to ask are: one, what's a core activity you perform in your job? And two, within what scope of data do you perform this task? When task roles are created at a granular level like this, with a transparent naming convention, it's easy to decide exactly who gets access to do precisely what and within what confines. After we come up with these task roles, we group them into job roles. We create buckets of task roles that are generally created for groups of users who need the same access. Now, when we say job role, we don't necessarily mean making a new security role within CE. This is more of an abstract exercise that your company would perform to roll up these task roles into a theoretical job role bucket. Once your organization has job roles defined, we recommend going through the mapping process of mapping these job roles to job titles within your company. These don't necessarily need to align in a one-to-one relationship. We could create a job role which we call executive read-only, which contains task roles at the display level designed for all executives within the company. Then the CEO, CMO, CFO, and all other members of the executive team may also receive this role. Your organization will want to maintain this matrix in a central location that's maintained through your governance processes. Then these job roles and task roles will become the guidelines for your user provisioning process. We develop a tiered approach for the roles to ensure that when we assign the security roles, it's very clear to the reviewer, the approver, or the system administrator when access is being assigned. 4 is typically represents your IT and your sensitive functions like setups and configuration, user assignment, or role modification. 3 would represent your update activity and your transactional capabilities. 2 is going to be your display or your read-only roles, and 1 would include just your birthright role or roles that every employee gets. So taking it a step further into our role naming convention, when you go about creating these task roles, you want to make sure you have a clear methodology for your naming convention. The naming convention will keep consistency and provide transparency for what roles provide what access. We've all seen roles called marketing supervisor and marketing extra special supervisor, but we're pretty unclear on what extra special meant and what type of access that provided. And I don't think an end user reviewing the roles or a manager requesting the roles necessarily understands that either. So the first component of our naming convention, by best practice, is to denote that a role is a custom role. Here, we start with a Z as our way of representing the custom build. We use Z, but it could be BB or XYZ or whatever you may prefer. Then we denote what module this task is rooted in, such as sales or marketing. Then we add in our 1, 2, 3, or 4 sensitivity level that we just talked about, representing those tiers. These will help you to differentiate your read-only roles from your update roles from your IT configuration roles. Our next piece brings in the scope of your access rights. This is where we'll designate whether a role's privileges are configured at the user, business unit, deep, or organization access level. Finally, one of the most important pieces of advice when configuring custom roles in D365 CE is to ensure that you create a baseline end user role. Your end user role will include the few fundamental privileges that every single user needs access to in order to be able to log on and do some basic things in the system. You should only include privileges that every single system user needs, and I emphasize every single system user needs and will always need access to. There are certain entities that grant access to base functionality in CE that need to be included. The baseline security role should include entities such as user entity UI settings and user entity instance data. These are ones that save information about the user's environment and usage. Some others include save view, user chart, and user dashboard. Once you have your end user role configured, it will be assigned to every single user and no questions asked. That way, these baseline privileges do not need to be built into every other role that your organization creates. Now that you see the importance of a naming convention, let's transition to some possibilities created through teams. Let's put these security concepts and this role methodology into action. So up to this point, I haven't talked too much about D365 CE's concept of teams. Teams are often underused in CE, but they can be a very powerful tool when used correctly. We're going to take a look at a couple common challenges that organizations have within CE's security structure and how we can use teams as the creative solution to overcome these challenges. First, let's cover the fundamentals of teams. There are 2 types of teams in customer engagement, owner teams and access teams. Today, we're going to focus on owner teams. There are a couple key features of owner teams that access teams do not have. First, owner teams, as the name implies, can own their own records. Remember earlier when we talked about the concept of record ownership and how an entity can either be organization owned or user and team owned? This is where this comes into play again. Next, an owner team can have its own security roles assigned, whereas an access team cannot. In CE, a security role can either be assigned directly to a user or directly to a team. So we need to remember these key relationships pertaining to teams. A team belongs to one business unit. However, a team can include users from any business unit, including users from the same business unit, a different business unit, and any combination you can think of. When a team is assigned a security role, A user on that team has the cumulative access of the privileges from that team's role, plus the role assigned to that user. However, this part commonly causes confusion. If a user is part of a team from a different business unit, and that team has a security role granting privileges at the business unit access level, the user would then receive those privileges within the team's business unit, not their own, unless they already have that privilege as part of a user security role. Think of it like this. When a team is assigned a security role and a user is assigned to that team, the user acts as if it was that team. It is in that team's shoes, in that team's business unit, with that team's security role. In essence, that user now has two different personas, if you will, its own user persona and its team persona. There are also a couple important things to know when using these team security roles. First, in order to own records, a team must have a security role that grants them access to the appropriate privileges to give them the ability to own these records. So for example, if we want a team to own a portion of lead records, that team must have a role with create and read privileges on the lead entity. Secondly, when using teams, also assign your baseline and user role to that team so that it can operate in the same fashion with the same base functionality that any user does. You'll want to pay attention here to this pro tip at the bottom. Every business unit has a default team automatically created by the system. You should not assign security roles to the default team. This is because when users are added to a business unit, they're automatically added to the default team of that business unit. Therefore, they could inherit all of those privileges from that team security role by mistake. Next, let's talk about teams to manage record ownership. When using teams to manage record ownership, our main purpose is to share records and enable collaboration. There are a few key benefits of using teams for record ownership. Unlike users, teams don't leave the company and have their accounts disabled. Teams also don't move often and have position changes within the company. So they're most likely not moving from one business unit to another and carrying all of their records with them, which can wreak havoc in the system. Finally, we can easily share records with many users from other business units through team membership. I want to lay out a common scenario here in which, in addition to the records a user owns, he or she regularly needs access to a portion, but not all of the records within their business unit. Let's look at this example here. The user in the Southeast business unit, here in the center, needs access to modify this subset of leads within their business unit. They don't need access to the entirety of the lead records within their business unit, though. If this user is assigned basic privileges, they won't have enough access. But if the user is assigned business unit privileges, they'd have too much access, as then they'd be able to modify all lead records within that business unit. So our solution here is to create a team for this particular subset of records. We'll call this team Event Sales. First, the records can be reassigned to this team so that the team is now the owner of these records. Then we'll assign a security role to the team. That security role will have basic access level privileges on these type of lead records. Now, the user and other users can be added to the team to inherit the privileges necessary to collaborate on this exact portion of records without receiving too much access. And of course, we can add users from different business units, like you see here, a user coming from the Northwest business unit and a user coming from the Northeast business unit. Now, we're going to take a look at a very different new option for how we can use teams. What we'll discuss here is how we can use a team to streamline the role provisioning process. Remember, a job role is a grouping of task roles created for a group of users who typically need the same access. In some cases, we can use a team to represent one of these job roles. In this case, there are a number of individuals in an organization that need read-only access to records across the entire organization. For these individuals, we will create a team called Executive Display Only. We will assign a few different task security roles to this team, including the end user role, the sales display role, the marketing display role, and the service display roles. These roles will all have been configured beforehand during our task-based role build. We then add those individuals that are mapped to the executive display only job role to this team. The simple thing about this is that we only need to assign these security roles once instead of multiple times for each user. As the executive team changes over time at the company, users will be added and removed from this team. But security roles do not need to be touched. This is one way to streamline the role provisioning process and set yourself up for a low maintenance structure as individuals enter, leave, and change positions in your organization. Now that we've talked a little bit about user provisioning, let's wrap it up and take it even one level higher. After you've taken these steps and your organization has a strong security build in place, we need a good strategy for handling roles moving forward, and along with that, other core governance pillars in place. You need a strong governance foundation established in order to achieve security continuity in your applications. Governance policies should be designed to enforce, control, and sustain your access management model. The leading practice governance pillars include segregation of duties management and conflict mitigation, role management and ongoing updates to roles based on changing business requirements, periodic and scheduled user access reviews, the management of elevated temporary access, which is your access to those system administrator type roles, user provisioning management, and finally, change management policies. At a high level, organization leadership is responsible for putting these pillars in place to achieve high quality access management. And that wraps up the content we had for today. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope these lessons on CE security best practices can help you take some next steps in securing your environment and empower you with these creative strategies. If you'd like to learn more, take a look at some of Protivity's thought leadership on dynamic security that I've included here, and go follow our Protivity Technology Consulting blog. Thank you all so much, and thanks again to DynamicsCon for hosting this.